Hi everybody, and welcome to what will probably be the most lengthy and ambitious tutorial that I've done on this channel. This time we are covering Copied City from the NieR Automata piano collections. I posted the performance of this pretty recently, a couple months ago, and it has quickly shot up relative to a lot of my other performances. It has outright eclipsed them. And at least one person has already expressed interest in sheets. I don't do sheets, I do tutorials, so my hope is that I can sort of spell out a lot of what's going on throughout. We're going to go section by section like I always do, and I hope that by spelling out what's going on, it makes it easier for people to understand and possible for you to pick up. So let's get to it. So, right away, we have the opening 8 measures, which is probably one of the most iconic sections of the song, really. And it's also one of the most abstract sounding parts of the song. And what's important to remember is, like, throughout this entire song, no matter what part you're listening to or trying to play, we're in, like, a 6/8 time signature. So, always think in groups of 6/8 notes at a time, one back to back to back. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually try to play the right hand of the first 8 measures, accentuating, like playing the first of each 6 notes more heavily than the others, so you can start to pick out how the measures actually line up. So before we move on, I kind of want to double back to the right hand part to explain some of the things I'm doing with like what fingers I use for what notes. The first thing that I want to mention is I tend to play the right hand part kind of staccato. You don't necessarily have to do that. I just find that I'm much less likely to accidentally flub and hit multiple notes, especially when when you're about to make a large jump. Um, Now, in terms of what fingers I use for what, so let's just kind of work our way through this. First thing to note is I'm using my ring finger here. Why? Because this note comes next. So if I were to use my pinky here, I would have a problem. So I don't want to do that. So the next thing that's probably worth noting is I'm using my pinky here, not my pinky, my ring finger, I can count, here. Again, this is to give myself leeway and room to start moving down so that I can do that. And now, after we hit this note, we have a tiny breather in the right hand, but we need to move back up to, we need to do a jump back up to there. This one can definitely throw you off. I actually find, when I was making this tutorial, I was actually having a problem playing this part slow, because I find that when I'm playing faster, this feels more natural, because doing this fifth from thumb to pinky, like, I feel like my pinky should be moving more than that, but no, that's right. And when you're playing faster, I don't know, I feel like it comes more naturally. But anyway, I want to hit that with my pinky because I need to do that next. So we're gonna have our thumb here from where we were before on the B flat, then pinky on top F, then immediately index thumb on the G and F below. Whoops. The rest should be pretty self-explanatory. That part flows pretty naturally. So the other reason why I wanted to accentuate where the beginning of each measure is there is because for the left hand, each phrase in the left hand, which is just a few notes, each phrase starts at the beginning of a measure. So understanding where the right hand lines up with it might help you out to straighten out where the left hand should come in, or when it should come in, I should say, and avoid getting confused about where you should be at in the right hand at the same time. So Let me just play the left hand alone so you can get an idea of the sequence of events there. So then, when you put it together, it ends up sounding like this. I'm going to play this slow so that it should be a little easier to follow. Okay, moving on to the next set of 8 measures. First of all, the right hand. The right hand for this is really easy to learn. There, you just learned it. In all seriousness, though, like, all it is that, over and over and over again. That's all you have to do for the right hand for the entire 8 measures. That was half of it right there. I had to go back in my head and count how many I just did. Anyway, moving on to the left hand, which bears more explaining. Let me play that out slowly for you. Alright, let me go through the left hand again and explain some of the fingering going on there. So, first of all, that much is straightforward. Now let me explain that a little bit. So we crossed over on the thumb on the F here. So this much is mostly straightforward. Here, I'm electing, there's probably multiple ways you could possibly do this. I'm electing to transfer my ring finger to the E flat, so that I can continue moving my hand down and hit the C with my pinky. Now, the only thing about this is, well, one of the points of hitting this with my pinky is it's more natural to get to the C sharp or D flat, which is coming up 2 notes from them. It would be more awkward if I were hitting the C with another finger and then needing to readjust to hit that with my pinky. And I do need to hit that with my pinky because it's those 2 notes. It would be more awkward to try to hit that with something else. So you're going to want to get used to this. That much is relatively straightforward. The only thing is, you are going to need to jump right back down to here. So if that's not comfortable for you, you might be able to devise some other way of doing that with other fingers to get down there, but that's the way I do it. So then the third phrase here is actually exactly the same as the first one. Except then we're going to be heading down to here. So again, practice that. It's something you're going to have to get used to. So you could probably do this a few different ways. I do it that way. So index, thumb, and then index again, but then I can just cross over and do things the way you would pretty much normally do this as a scale. Or I forget if I use. Sometimes I think too hard about this when I'm spelling it out for people. I use either index or middle finger for that. Either way, doesn't really matter because you're going to be jumping to here afterwards. So that's something you're going to want to practice. We'll get into this in the next section, but a lot of this song is going to be practicing jumps between sections. And that is definitely a big one. You're basically going to be doing that, because that's what comes next. don't feel like you need to rush that. If you listen to, this is something worth pointing out, if you listen to the original version of this on the Piano Collections, there's a bit of a pause. Actually, if I recall correctly, there's a bit of a pause on both ends of these 8 measures, 9 to 16. There's a bit of a pause coming into it, and then there's a bit of a pause moving out of it to the next section that we're about to hit up next. Before we get into the next measures, though, I do want to play 9 through 16 with both hands at a reduced speed for you. So at the end there, I was kind of trying to just position my left hand where it's going to need to jump to in the next section coming up. The one other thing I will mention about playing this at the same time, so like I jokingly belittled that the right hand is just, that swapping between the chord and the one note. It's very easy when you're starting out learning this to get crossed up in terms of, oh crap, I'm playing the wrong thing on the wrong beat in the right hand. So that's something to just, slow down, take it easy, get used to playing them both together, and eventually you won't have a problem with it. Okay, before I go too far into the next set of measures, 17 to 32, we're going to cover it all at once because it's very thematically related. I want to point out a melodic theme that I want you to pay attention to because I think this will help you out in making sense of both the right hand and the left hand, because this theme is going to be prominent towards the top of what both of those hands are doing in this next set of measures. So take a listen. So each of those notes represented one measure. So each of those notes represented 6 notes in the actual sequence of events coming up. So just keep that in mind as we go into the right hand and then the left hand, and try to place that, try to notice that in what we're doing up ahead. Okay, so first up, the right hand for measures 17 to 32. The first thing to note going into this is, just like in the last section, where it was like a repetition of just a chord and then a note, this section has a little more to it than that, but each measure, so each set of 6 beats, is going to be the same 2 things. So, for example, that is the first measure. So keep that in mind as you follow along to this section. So I probably should point out that there is one particular chord you may have noticed in the right hand that kind of requires a stretch. It is that one. This is particularly difficult because you have to have your index finger on C and your middle finger on E flat, so that you can this is so that you can easily swap over to the lower B flat with your thumb. So that could take some work. That is going to be the hardest part of this section in either hand. The left hand has some stretching going on too, but it's easier to manage because you can pivot. The left hand is only going to be hitting a single note at any given time. So you've got, for this I can reach this, but if you had to, a better example would be the next one actually, because that one I do have to pivot. We're gonna look into that left hand next up, but just figured I'd point out the varieties of stretching you may have to do in this section. So next, let's take a look at the left hand. Now remember, in the previous section I mentioned there is a little bit of a pause between the previous section and this section, and you are going to be jumping from around here to here. You want your thumb to be on this note because you're going to be going that way. One other thing that I wanted to point out about the left hand is you want to learn this part really well. You want to work it into your muscle memory. You want it to become second nature. You want to be able to play this without looking. You will understand why when we get much further on in the song. You'll thank me later. So one more thing I want to point out about the left hand. I'm hoping most of it is straightforward enough to be picked up based on just showing it played there. But two things to point out. First of all, the second half of that entire section is very similar to the first half. What the rest of your hand, other than the thumb, is doing is effectively the same to both halves. And also, again, remember that I showed off the sort of melodic theme at the beginning of this section. You should notice that your thumb is always playing to that melodic theme, while the rest remains constant. The other thing to point out is the last phrase in each half. This part. That is essentially a callback to what we did earlier in the previous section. And also, I want to point out, I am ending on my middle finger. That is useful, one, for getting back there for the second half, but also, what we're going to end up doing in the next section is crossing over like this, because we're going to be going up there. So get used to that finger. That's what you're going to want to do for the next section. In the right hand, you're going to want to get to this F, so you're going to want to do that with your pinky, because we're going to go down there. So with that all said, we will be getting to the next section shortly, but first, let me just play both hands of 17 through 32 together in review before we move on. Okay, on to measures 33 through 48. This is a case where again, it's sort of halves, and the back half is very similar to the front half. In fact, with the right hand in particular, the back half is identical to the front half, so we will just go over 33 to 40, and then you just repeat it. I'm not going to go crazy into breaking this down, but I will lead with, you want to pay attention to what fingers I am using to hit what notes and where I am crossing over. This section is very fluid, and you don't want to be like hunting for where your fingers need to be. You don't want to be tripping over yourself. You want to find very like comfortable places to cross over so that it can just be one fluid melody the entire way, and that way it'll turn out really good. Okay, so let's look at the left hand for this section. Now, the left hand is also more or less split into halves. They are not quite identical. They are really close, though. Generally speaking, the second half is played one octave lower. and the fourth and eighth measure of the second half are the only parts with differences other than that. So I'm going to play the first 8 measures on the left hand first, and then we'll compare going through the second half in contrast to the first. Alright, so let's look at the second half of the left hand for this section and compare and contrast it. So first of all, we're going to be starting down here rather than up there like we were before, which actually, that's what flowing into this second half looks like, essentially. Now, the first 3 measures of the second half are going to be effectively the same other than the octave difference. Now, once we get here, I'm going to point out one specific difference. In the first half in the left hand, I played the next note with my index finger because it does that. However, for the second half, I'm actually going to prefer going to my middle finger here. Why? Because the next measure is going to be a little bit different. That's your fourth measure of the second half with your left hand. So that's a little bit different. Then we go back to what it was. So that much was the same. But then we're going to be, the 7th and 8th measures are going to be different as well. That's your 7th and 8th measures right there. And it does kind of like rise in intensity as you're going through, as you're playing those octave steps. Let me put it all together so you can kind of see how it pans out in practice. Alright, moving on to measures 49 to 56. Now, the first 6 out of 8 of these are really the hard part of this. And the last 2 are more of sort of connecting measures to the next 8 after this, to the point where it almost feels like 6 and 10 rather than 8 and 8, but I'm still going to do them 8 at a time anyway. It's another part that because of that it can feel kind of abstract, but it really isn't. It's actually straightforward. It's a multiple of 4 in terms of number of measures. But yeah, so the first 6 measures, there's a lot of arpeggiation in the left hand going on, and some inversions of chords in the right hand. Now, there's going to be, in terms of both the left and right hand, the first 6 measures, it's going to be 2 by 2 by 2 in terms of chord progression. There's going to be, the first 2 measures focus on a single chord, even though there's 2 inversions going on in the right hand. Same with the 3rd and 4th measures, and the 5th and 6th are actually just 1 chord repeated in the right hand. So I'm going to do one hand at a time, as usual, just so you can start to get a sense for it. You will really want to develop a muscle memory for what's going on in the right hand, because chances are you're going to need to be looking at what your left hand is doing. But let's take a look at each of them. So one thing I guess to point out in the right hand is for the first 2 measures, you're cycling between 2 notes on the right hand on the first beat, and then 1 note. You've got that, and you've got that. But then on the measures after that, you're switching between 3 notes in 1 note rather than 2 notes in 1 note. So you've got all three of those, and then all three of those, and then... and also, the phrase that we end with, that, if that sounds familiar, it should. We just heard that in the previous set of measures that we just went over, and you're going to be hearing it a lot more. So keep your ears tuned for that one. Let's move on to the left hand. So this is another section where having a plan as to where you're going to cross over so you don't run out of fingers is important. Especially in measures 5 and 6, you'll notice that I cross over, like, there's a point where I'm crossing over every other note. Here, here, and then... so yeah, like, I'm switching back to my thumb very often there. And then at the end of that part, actually... There's two things you can do here. I think here I was demonstrating going to the thumb here, which makes sense because that's where you're going after it, but what I tend to do in practice, I think, when I'm playing full speed is just naturally going to the ring finger here, which is okay because you're going to have time to move your hand to get to the next two notes. So do whatever feels comfortable once you start scaling up in terms of speed. So let's take a look at that section together, and then we'll move on. Alright, so moving on to measures 57 to 64. This should be a little easier to pick up than the last 8 measures. The left hand is pretty simple. The right hand has some flowing phrases going on, but you'll have more headroom to focus on that now. I'm going to go into the right hand first, as usual. One thing I want to point out, though, is I'm going to include one note in the left hand when I'm playing the right hand only. I'll play it with my left hand, but just to make it obvious where the second measure starts, and what's actually going on. Like, that one note gives it a lot of context to make it a lot more straightforward to learn, I feel. So that's going to be thrown in there. Also, keep an ear out for that phrase that I said was going to be repeating a lot. You're going to hear it again in this right-hand part with one slight variation at the end of it. So take a look. So to explain the right hand a bit, first of all, this is starting on our ring finger because that's where we came from out of the previous phrase, like that. Now at this point the left hand is doing its thing, but what's happening in that second measure where I purposely left one of the left hand notes in to illustrate, is that the left hand's doing that in the first measure, and in the second measure, the right hand is basically picking up for the left hand so that the left hand can go do other left hand things. So the rest of that is mostly straightforward, just follow the progression. And then at the end, we do have this phrase again. Except, that's a little bit different, so keep an eye on that. Don't forget that that's just slightly different than what this phrase is gonna has sounded like before and is mostly going to sound like. So let's look at the left hand. So yeah, the left hand is pretty straightforward. There's a couple of different ways you can do some parts of it. So like when we're after the first measure, which is pretty much, like, it is what it is. After that, we're going to start going down. I think what I tend to do is... There's a couple jumps in there, but you've got plenty of time to execute them. What you could... There's a couple things you could do instead if you wanted to make it a little more continuous, I guess, for the lack of a better word coming to my head. Because what you could do is you could switch to thumb here so that you could just go straight on down to here. And if you really wanted to feel like going Stretch Armstrong on this, you could actually do something like that so that you don't have to jump again, and you'll be in position for this. I feel like that's a little bit uncomfortable, so I prefer the jumps because I have plenty of time to set them up, but it's up to you what you feel like doing. So let's put that all together, and then we'll move on. Okay, measure 65 to 80. This is really the start of a significant portion of the song, and there's going to be a lot of like repeated themes such that as you're learning this part, you're going to learn stuff that easily transfers to other parts coming up really soon. Now, measure 65 to 80 are really, like, that's a 16 measure block, but it's really the same 8 measures repeated twice, so there's really only 8 measures to learn here. Again, the right hand is going to have a lot of fingering to focus on to make sure you're not tripping over yourself and just having smooth transfers across the whole thing. And the left hand is really just a lot of repeated patterns. It's really 2 by 2 by 2 in terms of measures, again, like some of the previous ones. So let's take a look, starting with the right hand again. So I mentioned there was going to be a lot of repeating of themes. In fact, if you're paying close attention, we already are seeing some repeating of themes. Actually, a whole bunch of this right-hand part is very similar or the same as the part we just learned right before this. That entire part is the same. The only difference is the part we learned before this does that, but this part does that instead. Also, I probably screwed up the fingering there, playing it out of context. And then the last 2 measures, take out the top notes for a second. And what do you have? You have that, again. But what we're actually doing, the right hand is playing double duty here. If you've listened to the original version of this song from the game, there's actually strings going on above the piano, and that's playing those 2 notes, but we're doing both. Like that. I just screwed it up a little bit, but that's what's going on there. So there's a ton of reuse of themes going on in the right hand here. It's jam-packed full of it. Let's take a look at the left hand before moving on to the next section, where we're going to see even more reuse of themes. Okay, so the left hand, I feel, is pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, except there's one thing that I want to point out. You might have noticed that the very end of that seemed a little bit off in terms of rhythm, and it is. And this threw me for a loop when I was learning this by ear. The very last phrase, that is like, this is the one phrase, I mean, we're going to have this happening a couple times, obviously, because these 8 measures repeat twice. But that one phrase is where we break out of the 6/8, the steady rhythm, through the whole song. Because what's actually happening there is that note is happening in the middle. We're getting we're getting that. That's going to take some getting used to, and earning some muscle memory of how those two work together. That's definitely going to take, that's going to take a bit of work. And it felt so off to me for a while. It's just like, am I sure that the song is doing that? But, no matter how many times I listen to it, yeah, that's what the song is doing there. And it's kind of interesting. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're learning this. That is a thing that happens there. So let's look at the two together where you can see that last part happening in context. Alright, on to measures 81 to 96. These are in some ways very similar to the previous 16 measures. So we'll start out in the right hand again, and the first thing you're going to notice is that basically 3/4 of this is exactly the same as the measures before. So just pay attention in particular to the last two measures of the right hand when we do this. Alright, so let's look at the last two measures of that in detail. The first thing to realize is, again, this is based on that same melody that we're hearing over and over. Except, so in the previous set of measures that we just studied, we had those notes added to it, reflecting the strings in the original song. Well, now the strings move up to here. Now the problem with that is, well, that's fine, but the original melody here has an F coming up. That's really hard to hit, so the piano version doesn't do that. It does this instead. So a couple things to note there. First of all, you're going to have kind of a big jump going from there to there. And the other thing is, you're going to slide your thumb down. That's pretty much the only way you're going to hit these notes. Because your pinky's, needs to be up here, therefore you don't really have any other fingers available to cross over or anything. So you're going to slide your thumb to hit the G after the A flat. So let's look at the left hand. Alright, so now let's take a look at what the left hand does differently in this section versus the previous one. So the first two measures are the same. And actually so is the third. But the fourth measure in the previous section stays there. But in this, we kind of add a little more determination to the mix here by moving to this E flat. And that's basically bridging between the D flat and the F. So, and then we're gonna do the same thing going back down after the F. So, whereas the previous set of measures just had two Fs, two D flats, two Fs, this is gonna have F, F, D flat, E flat, F, E flat. So that's your first six measures. And then the last two, whereas the previous set of measures moved up here, we're gonna be on A flat, but we're gonna move down instead. Like that. Now, the one thing to note here is that I am crossing over to a degree there so that I can land on F with my pinky here, because this is immediately going to transition into the second half of this, which is mostly the same, and it starts on F, so by doing that, we're in the right position to just continue. That's definitely a tough one to get used to, and it's definitely something that you're probably going to want to slow down to get used to it before you bring it to full speed. And that's really going to be that's going to be a common technique for a lot of this, really. Don't try to play this at full speed to begin with. Learn it, start getting it into your muscle memory a little bit slower, and then gradually speed it up. Now, for the second half of this, it's nearly identical to the first half, just like the previous section was, except that very last B flat based measure, it's just those 4 notes in the second iteration of this section. And the reason why is to give you time to move your left hand to where it's going to need to be next, because that's where your left hand is going to be going for the section coming after this. So let's look at this all at once, both hands, for the full 16 measures, and then we'll move on. Okay, I've grouped the next set of 12 measures together, and that seems like a weird number, but there's a very good reason why. Measures 97 through 108 are exactly the same as measures 57 through 68. You've done these before. And since we've done these before, I'm just going to go through them once a little closer to normal speed as sort of a review, and also so you can kind of see what things look like as you speed them up, and put together a little more than the way I had them split up when I went over them originally. Alright, up next is measures 109 through 116. These are pretty interesting. This is stuff we, technically speaking, haven't seen before, at least not in the way we're going to see them here, but it does incorporate and weave together at least 3 different phrases that we have seen in the past. So let's look at the right hand first. So some things to point out in the right hand of this section. First of all, the fingering that I use in the second and third measures of this section, that's what works for me. There's probably other variations that you might find more comfortable. Like this is a bit of a stretch. And then what I do is I go to ring finger here, and then index finger there. Like, there's a couple of stretches in there that might seem a little bit awkward to you, and it's totally fine if you want to come up with an alternative way to finger that. I didn't want to go to 5 here, because I feel like there's way too much potential for me to mess up and hit the wrong note here with my pinky if I were to do the switch like that, so I don't do that. But it would potentially make that transition a little more natural. So if you want to try that, go ahead, see what works and is more consistent for you. I shouldn't say more comfortable, I should say more consistent, because that's what I prioritized in terms of how I do that. And then later on in this section, that is, again, a repetition of a phrase we have heard over and over before. It does change up a bit here. And then this last thing, we heard that in the left hand a long, long time ago towards the beginning of this entire song. And actually, that is doubled between the right hand and the left hand in this part. So we're going to look at the left hand coming up next, and just you'll see that happen and keep it in mind, and it'll be more obvious when we do both hands together. Alright, so the first half of this section in the left hand is really just application of stuff we've heard before in a slightly different order, because we've got the usual like those are the exact same arpeggios that we had in the previous sections. It's just in this case it's F, E flat, D flat, E flat. So that's your entire first half of the section. And then we've got another F, and then just the octaves for an entire measure, and then you've got some time to get up here. This is one to remember. Just get used to going to there so that it sticks in your mind. And then, as I mentioned when we talked about the right hand, this is totally straight out of something we saw in the left hand early in the song. And this same sequence of notes is going to be happening in the right hand at the same time. And then we're going to launch into the next section, which is probably one of the toughest sections. But before we get there, let's review this all at once, both hands. Alright, measures 117 through 132. This is probably the second hardest part of the song. It's really interesting. It's very technical, it's very interesting. It can be a lot of fun to play, but boy is it easy to trip over. And it's got some of the most intricate interplay between hands going on, and that's kind of what makes it difficult. That and there's a bunch of jumps going on. So I am going to make an attempt to play the right hand in isolation and the left hand in isolation. There's going to be, in particular, one specific point in the middle of each of the 8 measures where it's not going to make a whole lot of sense until you hear them together. But at least you'll learn what to focus on in each hand, at least the way that I do it. There may be more than one way to tackle this beast. But I will outline the way that I'm doing it, and we will probably spend a bit of time going over how this works out with both hands together, too. But let's start by just looking at the right hand, which is probably the simpler of the two hands for the most part. One of the things that actually makes this section one of the hardest is that the left hand is doing the majority of the leg work. Well, or the finger work, I guess. It's a hand. I don't have the legs on it. But anyway, we'll do the right hand first. So the right hand is, for the most part, just carrying this overarching melody over what the left hand is going to be doing. But you'll notice that, particularly in around the 5th or 6th measure, and then again on the second half, we've got some stuff sort of encroaching from what the left hand is doing. That will make more sense once you hear what the left hand is doing, because you're going to see sort of a break in the left hand at the same time. Again, this I just find the easiest way for me to do it, partially because, well, if I were to try to do this all in the left hand, I would really have to, duck underneath what my right hand is doing, so I just threw it into the right hand. So what am I actually doing here? Well, the most important thing to note here is, again, I've got a thumb slide from an A flat to a G going on. And then this actually becomes easier on the second half, where there's no doubled A flat, so I can actually finger this a little more naturally. Other than that, the right hand is pretty straightforward. That's just the one part to really call out and pay attention to, because it's where the hands have significant danger of overlapping if you don't think about how to divide and conquer the part. But let's look at the left hand to put this in more context. So you might be wondering, hey, this is a 16 measure part, right? Why'd you stop after 8 measures? Well, the good news about the left hand is that it's the same 8 measures repeated twice. The bad news is that's pretty much the only good news, because this is hard. So let's kind of step through it a little bit. This is going to be your first hard part, because your hand is naturally going to land here, but you need to jump to here. And then again we need to jump. We've actually got 2 jumps, because we got to go from there to here to here. And actually we're not going to play... This is the part where the right hand takes over. So that's what it actually looks like when you put both hands together. So the left hand is just doing... that. The one thing I will point out here is there's a couple of... You're going to want to gain pinky confidence in this section, at least the way that I finger it, because there's a couple of points where the pinky has some important notes that you need to nail. And if you got like a weak pinky or something, you may risk slipping off. So this is something to really get used to, get some muscle memory in there. This whole section, muscle memory, is really... You're probably sick and tired of me saying muscle memory through this entire song, but there's a lot of it. There's a lot to be said for just getting your hands used to playing the things so that you can start putting both hands together and starting to play faster and, you know, getting up to the actual speed of the song. But yeah, so what do we have here? You'll notice that, so we've got this other F down here, but then what I do is I start the next phrase with my ring finger here. Why? Because that gets me to this position, which is good, because there's another note that I need to hit up here. And here's one of those pinky notes that I was referring to. And then we just do that. So yeah. Getting used to having your pinky in the right position so that you hit those and don't slip off of them. Just keep that in mind. And yeah, the left hand is exactly the same for the second half. The right hand is a little bit different. There's more going on the right hand in the second half, so it really pays off to get used to each part individually. It's going to be very common to slip up on especially the second part of the right hand because of the additional things that are going to be going on there. But let's look at both hands together. Alright, so yeah, there's a lot to digest in this section. I guess if I were going to point out a couple of things. First of all, again, the left hand is doing the brunt of the work in this section. And also, there are a few points where the right hand is basically doing nothing for an entire 2 measures. So like you can totally just focus on your left hand there. And then, let's see. Again, after that, same thing there. One thing that I should actually point out about that, which is easy to screw up when I'm doing it in isolation and not finger it correctly. I actually want to end on my index finger here, because that's going to make it easy to just continue, because you're going to dip down to this low F and then bounce right back up to exactly where my index finger already is, if I do it that way. And the toughest part of this, other than the parts where the left hand basically crosses over into the right hand, the beginning of the second half is one of the toughest parts, just because. So, like in the beginning, you have just that. In the second iteration, you have that. It is really easy to screw that up. I was screwing that up for a while. So you definitely want to focus on practicing that part together with both hands until you're confident that you're not going to screw up the right hand there. And then again, you're going to have more time to focus on your left hand towards the end of that. So you've got... Well, there I guess you're focusing on both hands, but like you don't have to worry about the right hand doing stuff at the same time. So like in the first half, you're doing that. You're doing that at the same time, but in the second one you're just doing this. So you actually have a little less to focus on there on the right hand. So like if you want to like pick and choose which parts you learn first in terms of them being like the slightly easier variations of the other, then like yeah, just like say, all right, measures 5 through 8 are kicking my butt, so I'm going to try measures 13 through 16 first. That's totally viable. But yeah, this section is going to take a lot of work. Don't feel bad that it's rough, because it is rough. And there's just a lot to keep track of. I feel like I'm probably not even doing that great of a job here trying to like break it down, because there's only so much I can do when the section is that challenging. But yeah, just don't get discouraged and keep working things into, just get your hands used to doing the individual parts until you can start putting them together and you're more and more comfortable doing that. With that said, let's move on to something far easier. So, I did say far easier. I guess I shouldn't call any part of the song easy, because it is a technically challenging song. But measures 133 to 164, you might be thinking, holy cow, dude, that's a lot of measures to worry about at once. Don't worry about it. The reason I say this is far easier is because you've practiced all of this before. These measures are, with the exception of the very beginning of the right hand, they are exactly the same as measures you've already done. Actually, 33 to 64. I don't know if it's a coincidence that this is exactly the same as exactly 100 measures ago, but it is. That's the fact of the matter. So the only difference here is that the right hand starts with that instead of... That's what the original right hand sounded like. That's what this sounds like, because it's actually like... This is sort of the exit out of what came before it. That's why that octave stab is there. But other than that, this is exactly the same, like I said, as 100 measures ago. So I am, again, like I did last time we were in sort of a review part, I'm just going to go through this at much closer to regular speed so that you can see a considerable chunk of the song really put together and sort of more at its natural pace as opposed to when I'm slowing things down. So let's take a look at that, and then we will move on to other new stuff, new and exciting stuff after this. Alright, we have reached measures 165 through 196, which is arguably the climax of the song. The individual parts are relatively straightforward, but the right hand has a lot of jumps going on, and there is kind of a lot to unpack there. So we're going to spend a significant chunk of time just explaining what's going on there. There is a lot of repetition in this section as well, but there are also there's a few differences that pop up in the right hand, so I want to contrast sort of like parts that happen in the first half versus the second half, or even like first quarter versus second quarter and third quarter versus fourth quarter. So yeah, let's get into the right hand. So there's a lot to unpack in terms of similarities and differences in the right hand, but let's just kind of step through it first. Because I also want to point out places that you're specifically going to want to practice. Which the very first one is actually the very start of the section, because we're coming from here. This is where we're at before this section starts, and we need to go from here to here. So that is a jump you're going to have to get used to. Now, going into this section, I'm just going to highlight a few parts to pay attention to as I play the first portion of it. So that's all fine and good. Keep that in the back of your head. This part, pay a little more attention to. Pay attention to that chord there. Now that should sound familiar to you, right? Because this is, surprise, a revisit to a section we did a while ago. This is another jump that you're going to have to... all of these things, there's just always jumps. There's always leaps of faith after this. We had that before. We have that now. Different inversion, same chord. After that, this part is pretty straightforward because these two fingers are going to stay exactly where they are. Like, hey, that sounds like some Final Fantasy stuff or something. I don't know. And then... now let's just compare that to the earlier part of the same half of the section, because we had that the first time, and then the second time we had... it's the same thing, other than that one repetition of the second iteration of that chord jumping down an octave. So that's the first half. Now the second half starts out exactly the same, with the same first 6 measures as the first half. Now here we get a little bit different. So before we were going here, but instead we're going here. And then, that should also sound familiar. This was the second half version of that phrase from earlier. So we had that, and then we had... these were from the parts earlier where I said that the right hand was doing double duty between the piano and the strings in the original version of the song. It's exactly the same phrase as those. And actually you'll notice that the left hand is going to be exactly the same as those parts before too, but we'll get to that in a bit. So yeah, reviewing again. We have that in the second half instead of that in the first half. And then this is going to be exactly the same jump and all. Again, practice this jump. So all that was the same as the first half, but instead of going back up, we're staying down here. And this chord is even more unique than the previous one. So like from first to second half up here, we went from here to here. Well, take that and replace this note with that note, and you get that down there. So again, that was wrong. That was, yeah, ignore what I just did there. That's correct. So And that's the back half of that. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but there's differences to keep notice of, and there's jumps that you're going to want to have to practice. And that's about all I have to say about the right hand. A lot to unpack, though. Left hand, significantly less to unpack. Let's look at that. Alright, so you're probably thinking, hey, wait a second, that was only 8 measures, what gives? What gives is that same 8 measures is played 4 times, and that gives you this section. So, I told you there was a lot less to unpack in the left hand. However, there is a lot of important fingering going on here, because you're going to be playing this, once you get up to speed, you're going to be playing this pretty fast, and you're also going to need to have time to focus on where your right hand needs to go. You're going to need to look up there a couple times for the jumps that I pointed out earlier. So you're going to want to get this left hand down, really, work it in so that you don't have to think about the fingering and you don't have to worry about tripping over yourself. So let's just kind of point some things out. So I poke my index finger over here, I keep my thumb where it is so that I can do this, and then tuck it under. And you'll notice I'm kind of stretching my hand, and that's on purpose so that I have the minimum travel distance between here and there, as opposed to, well, I guess you could try to cross over again. I don't know. You can experiment with things, but this is what I do. And again, when you're going full speed, there's only so many things you have time to do. So this one is really interesting. I think I actually used the index finger there. So we have thumb, index, thumb again, middle finger so that I have enough, enough breadth of my hand here to get up there. And now I do not tuck down again here. I hit that note with my ring finger so that I can, again, get back down here really comfortably. And the third, I guess the 5th and 6th measures technically are the same as the 1st and 2nd, so that's nothing new. And then, the 7th and 8th measures should sound really familiar. That was from the section earlier in the song, complete with that one note that's bridging across 2 eighth steps in the rhythm structure. So there's really just 3 arpeggios. I mean, yeah, 4 arpeggios, I guess, technically, but there's basically 2 new arpeggios in this section, and then the third is the same as the first, and then the last 2 measures are stuff you've done before. So just work on practicing those arpeggios in sequence so that you don't have a problem getting to them, because you're probably going to be keeping an eye on your left hand pretty often in this part, but you're going to want to be able to take peeks at your right hand in advance of moving around, and some of the chords in the right hand you can probably feel your way to, so like that one, I am generally feeling for that, and I'm just keeping my eye on my left hand at that. But when you're getting to you might gain some sort of muscle memory for that, and actually I hit an extra note there because it's hard. But those are the sorts of things that you're going to want to at least take an advanced look at. Where do I have to get my right hand to next so that you have a feel for where you're going before you focus on your left hand again. So yeah, there's a lot going on at once here. Fortunately, the left hand isn't that much to learn, but mastering all this put together is definitely an undertaking. I'm going to play both of them together next. It's probably not going to be absolutely perfect. I'm going to do it, a little bit sped up at least, just so you can see what it all looks like in practice, and hear what it looks like, hear what it sounds like in practice. Hear what it looks like in practice? I got eyeballs coming out my ears now. But yeah, let's do that, and then we will be done with arguably the climax of the song. Alright, now that we're done with that whole climax section, the next 8 measures are very much a cooldown from that. So let's take a look, starting with the right hand as usual. Alright, so first of all, let's point out where this right hand is coming from in the previous measures. We're coming from this, and we're going to this. So notice that my middle finger is on E flat the entire time. So we just need to do a little bit of repositioning to get from there to there. And then it's just the alternating chord and then B flat, just like it was back at measures 9 to 16. Right near the beginning of the song. And the chords are just like gradually increasing, to roughly use that word. Because they go in order that. It's 2 measures of each. And if this stuff reminds you of measures 9 to 16, then there's a reason for that, as we'll see in what's coming up right after this section. But let's look at the left hand of this first. So just like in the right hand, where we were keeping the same finger on the same note from the previous section, that's also going to be true of the left hand here, because the previous measure was that, and that is our next note. And it's totally fine to play this with our thumb again, because we're going to have a full 2 measures to get over here. The one thing I will point out about this is you really don't want to play this too hard. Like, this is sort of just, like, it's not supposed to be overpowering. It's just kind of like, it's this ominous, like, unsettling presence in the left hand, while the right hand is doing its thing. And then for the last 2 measures, does that sound familiar? Because it should sound familiar. Because way at the beginning of the song, in measures 15 and 16, we had the exact same thing except 1 octave up. So that should be kind of familiar and not hard to learn, because your hands should already be slightly used to it if you've been practicing all up to this point. So let me just play both hands together, and then we will move on to what's next, which will be very familiar. Alright, the next 16 measures are effectively free because they're exactly the same as measures 17 to 32. So I'm just going to play them at closer to full speed, with both hands at once. The one thing I will point out is, I don't know whether this was intentional, but I feel like in the original, well, in the Piano Collections version of this that this tutorial is based on, I feel like it's a little bit faster than it was at the beginning of the song. It's up to you whether you really want to do that, and I will leave that to your discretion, primarily because of what will be coming after this. But let's get the both hands of this laid out first, and then we will move on to the hardest part of the song. Okay, so you may remember that earlier I referred to a part that we did as the probably second hardest part of the song. This is the hardest part, and the reason is what the right hand is going to be doing. The good news is the left hand is exactly the same as the last 16 measures we just did, which is also exactly the same as the second set of 16 measures in the entire song. The bad news is you need to know that really well, and you need to be able to do it without looking. you will be looking at what your right hand is doing for this entire section, and you will quickly see why. Since the left hand is identical, I'm not going to bother focusing on that alone. We're just going to focus on the right hand alone. I'm going to play the first 4 measures of the right hand, because measures 3 and 4 are then repeated for the remainder of the entire section. So I guess if you want one more little bit of good news, it's that the notes themselves are really easy to learn. Executing them, however, is a big, big problem. So let's look at the right hand, and then let's talk about the right hand. Alright, yeah, this is the hard part. That arpeggio is, let's face it, it's just uncomfortable, because you're going between thumb, index, and ring, and then, crossing / jumping over yourself, given how fast the section actually goes. Aside from the arpeggio itself, the other thing that makes this hard is the fact that this is triplets. So, the very beginning is still straight-up eighth notes, that part, but then once you jump into this, that's triplets. So you're playing 3 notes over 2 notes in the left hand. So one thing that you can potentially do to just start working on the rhythm is don't worry about all of the arpeggiation, just play the same 3 notes and practice the left hand at the same time. And then another thing you could potentially do there is practice that with your eyes closed, so that you're forcing yourself to not look at your left hand, because you're gonna need to, when you're doing the actual arpeggios, you're going to need to be looking at your right hand pretty much the entire time. In particular, in the left hand, I would say focus on making sure you're comfortable with the last 2 measures of each loop. It's really easy to get yourself, trip over yourself as you're crossing over up here, and end up hitting the wrong note and feeling silly about it. But yeah, this section requires the most practice. The one thing I will say is when you're inevitably grinding this section, don't grind it too hard. If your right hand starts feeling tired, it's gonna feel tired. I mean, at least if you're not superhuman. Give yourself a break, or switch to practicing the whole song, because we're actually really close to the end of the song. You could go and learn the last part of it, and then start playing the song end to end, just knowing that you're going to come back and focus on this part and maybe some other parts that you're finding, require more effort to master. But yeah, just don't fall into repetitive stress injury territory, please. If you feel like your right hand especially is getting worn out, then take a break. But yeah, you're going to inevitably make mistakes in this section. I'm pretty sure that the original performer on the piano collections makes a mistake in this section, because I'm pretty sure a couple of times at the very least you hear instead of doing, you hear, I feel like I hear that a couple of times in there. So that means they're missing this note. I'm assuming that's not intentional. And of course, if you look at my cover of it, this section is a little bit of a mess. I'm going to play the whole thing left and right hand at the same time just to demonstrate it so you can see it on the piano roll and stuff. I am going to make mistakes. Plain and simple. I'm going to cop to that. I'm not going to get this section perfect. So don't get too hard on yourself about this particular section. It is a doozy. But let's look at it together, and then let's move on to the end of the song, which is significantly easier, and you can feel some relief because you have reached the end of the song then. Alright, congratulations, you survived, and we are now at the last part of the song. I'm actually going to play both hands together here because it doesn't really make sense not to, because this section is very right-hand heavy. There is a large part of it where your left hand is doing nothing. So let's look at both together, and then I'll just kind of point out some things. But this should be a lot easier to learn than the previous section was. Okay, so first things first. If you may have noticed when you were watching me play both hands of the hardest section of the song right before this that I purposely ended on the first notes of this section because just to illustrate, you're coming out of this crazy arpeggio that we talked about, and instead of going to the G to go back up again, you're gonna go from the A flat on your index finger to the F on your pinky, and then you're immediately launching into what is, note for note, exactly the first 8 measures of the song again, except an octave down from where it was at the beginning of the song, because before it was up there, now it's down here. The left hand is doing nothing during this other than that first note for the next 8 measures. Now, once we get to the end of that pattern, that is your 8th measure of this section. We add in a repetition of that measure, which is exactly the same as the 8th measure at the beginning of the song. Note for note, both hands. You need to get used to your left hand being ready to come in on the correct notes here. That's where it's going to be coming back in, because you're going to do that. Your left hand's going to be doing nothing for 8 measures, and then it's going to do that. And then there's a longish pause for like a couple measures of duration, and then your final notes are that down here and that up here. So you've got FCF and CFGC. And that is the end of the song. Congratulations if you got to this part. You survived. And I hope this tutorial was super helpful. If there's anything that you feel needs a better explanation, let me know in comments, and I'll see if I can at least write an explainer if it doesn't actually require like a full-blown appendix to the video. It is a very technically demanding song. It is also a very fun song to play, so hopefully you get, hopefully you feel some reward come out of this. But yeah, good luck and have fun with this one.